Good evening, everyone. Firstly, thank you for your patience. We were giving people a few minutes to come in. The traffic, as you know, is always a bit of an issue around here. My name is Udayan Mitra. I am executive publisher at HarperCollins India. Great pleasure and privilege to be introducing this event. Welcome to the 2025 edition of the lecture presented by HarperCollins. And this will be followed by the launch of Devesh Kapur and Arvind Subramanian's new book, A Sixth of Humanity, and followed by a panel discussion. I think I should start with just a couple of sentences about the lecture. Many of you will know about this. This is a new initiative, new as in it's been 3 or 4 years. And the idea is to bring some of the most prominent minds and speakers from around the world who are writing on India, on issues that matter to us, to two audiences in India, particularly to Delhi, and for you to be able to see them, hear them, interact with them. And we have had in the past, we've had Amitav Ghosh, Ramachandra Guha, we have had Rajdeep Sardesai deliver the lecture. What we always do with the lecture is based on a new book that is of great significance to us as readers. And this evening is no exception. So, Dr. Subramanian and Dr. Kapur's lecture today will be based on their new book, A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey. Just a quick 1 minute to introduce the two speakers and authors who all of you know, but just to set the context. Devesh Kapur is the Star Foundation Professor of South Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins University, School of Advanced International Studies. Arvind Subramanian is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Washington, D.C., and former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. They have both come down from the US, and great pleasure to have them with us today. And now, very briefly about the book, Dr. Subramanian and Dr. Kapur are going to make a presentation and then talk about the book at length, followed by a conversation, so I'll be very brief. So, I don't know if you have a kind of a sort of the catch line of the book right there, the definitive book on the development history of India. So, independent India's journey, almost 80 years long now. It's been an interesting one. We opted for democracy before we charted a plan for development or social change. We started out as a socialist state and then veered towards becoming something of a capitalist one. The word Odyssey in the subtitle of the book is significant, and I think a very apt one. It's been a long trip. It's been something of an adventure. And through it all, our country has been able to sustain democracy and chart a course for economic progress. That's not a mean achievement. The book is deeply researched, very engagingly written, with many, many key insights and takeaways for the reader. I can say with confidence that A Sixth of Humanity is going to become the go-to book for anyone interested in the development history of the diverse and critically significant country called India and our possible future. Once you've read this book, it will take you a bit of time given its length, but I can promise you it's well worth it. It might take a long weekend to get through it. But once you've read this book, as economics Nobel laureate Simon Johnson says, you will never think of India or economic development in the same way again. We at HarperCollins are immensely proud to be able to bring this exceptional book to readers everywhere. We are also very proud to be able to publish the book first in India. This is a global book. It will publish later around the world, but Indian readers get to read it first. And I'm personally very happy about that. May I invite Dr. Devesh Kapur, Dr. Arvind Subramanian up on stage, and I'll hand it over to them for the lecture. After the lecture is concluded, we will move on to the second part of the evening, which is the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I'll just start off with a few slides, and then Arvind will follow. As the subtitle of the book is about India's development, or Odyssey, it's also been an odyssey for both of us. It's taken 5 years, and we've been thinking about it for longer. Before I start, I want to first thank HarperCollins for their immense support for bringing this book out. I want to thank our people who helped us, with the research, many of who are here with us, and also to thank you all for being with us. So, just very briefly, about the book. The book is deliberately interdisciplinary. We think it's comprehensive. The approach which we took was it's based on a pretty extensive reading of what we estimate is at least 3,000 official documents and reports. We've tried to make it a very data-intensive book. We've tried our best that the arguments flow out of the data. So we built data sets on most of the variables over 6 and sometimes 7 decades. The book is descriptive, it's analytical, but it is not prescriptive. So if you ask us what are the 3 things this government should do, or any government, we are not going to give any answers because everyone has 30 things. So that is not the intention of the book. So I think where we start is by showing that India had a particularly distinctive development trajectory. If you look at the history of economic development of the West, broadly speaking, the democracy and economic development were coterminous. As economic development increased, basically we are measuring this by the extension of the franchise that also gradually increased. A second approach was East Asia, where first they got a higher level of development, and then you got the franchise. The third is, of course, China, where you've had very high now levels of economic development, but without any democracy. But India was distinctive in that it started off its development journey at very low levels of income, but with universal franchise. This is based on a democracy index. It's based till 2010s. As many of you would know, India's score would have declined, but also I think next year you would see the score of the United States also having declined. So we begin with sort of 3 broad facts of India, which all of you are aware, which is extreme diversity, scale. We often forget that how much scale shapes the patterns of development. And the third is, of course, we tend to forget just how poor India was, and with large parts of the population living at levels of destitution at the time of sort of independence. So if you see here just how much of an outlier sort of India is at the income level at which you get universal franchise, and also the gap between male and female franchise. India was really a very much of an outlier when it began its development journey. Now, so many of these choices, again, you are well aware of, from the choice of course, universal franchise to initially high levels of centralization, secularism, the sort of language issue, so on and so forth. What I'm going to focus now is this one achievement which we think is unheralded. So what we show in the book is that we argue, if you look at the history of state building around the world, state building is always accompanied by massive levels of violence. That is inherent because the state, building a state is to give an entity a monopoly on violence, and that monopoly is achieved by crushing other sources that could compete with the state. What is distinctive about India is just how low levels of violence accompanied state building in India compared to all other larger countries that we are aware of. And we argue that one factor why levels of violence in India were much, much less in the process of state building was one of the great achievements of having universal franchise. The democracy was a key instrument of state and nation building because unlike, say, the Western experience of a nation building based on a single language, a single religion, that option was not available like to India. Now, we also showed that this order was not, that India is an outlier, not just in the low levels of violence that accompanied state building, but also sort of economic disorder was also much less in India, and we measure it by inflation and economic crisis. India also stands out in relatively lower levels of inflation compared to comparable countries, whether it's Mexico, Turkey, Brazil, and so on, and also far fewer crises. We all know the crisis of 65 and 91, but otherwise most other countries have had far more frequent crises as well as far higher levels of inflation, which are two indicators of economic disorder. Now, among the instruments of nation building, we argue in one chapter how fiscal federalism was one instrument of nation building. And in this graph, what you see is that over time, transfers to the poorer states gradually increased. First of all, transfers to states relative to the share of the center, the transfers to states increased, but transfers to poorer states, both on per capita terms, as well as in terms of as a share of state to domestic product, that also it began to steadily sort of increase. One of the distinctive parts as well, which is the other aspect of Indian federalism, we all sort of get obsessed with the relationship between tier 1 and tier 2, which is the center-state relationship, right? That's been an issue for decades. But actually, where India is an outlier is the level of centralization at level 2 relative to level 3, which is the centralization at the state level relative to the powers it enjoys over the third tier of government. And we are all aware of the attempts of the 73rd, 74th Amendment And that basically almost every state has trampled over the 74th Amendment, making sure that cities, which should have been the engines of growth, they are stifled, their autonomy has been stifled. Here, what you see is, in this graph, is the number of government personnel at different levels of government. And what you can see in China and the US, which are the other very large countries, government employees are largely at the local level or at the central level. In India, it's the opposite. Most government employees are at the state level. Both local and central government employees are relatively much less. One way we sort of look at state building is how the Indian state gradually integrated, because all states have a physical geography, and how this physical geography that we call India was gradually integrated in a physical sense. Here, what you have is this database we build on how to build, a sort of a bridges over, especially over rivers. And we know that rivers are a physical barrier. They impede market integration. So even by the 80s, Bihar had just one bridge over the entire Ganga that flowed through Bihar. The whole of the Northeast had just one bridge over the Brahmaputra. What you see is that a marked acceleration in this sort of physical integration in the last 3 decades. And that, of course, is true of transport, which we show through bridges, and it's also true of communications. In the first 3-4 decades, it was largely post offices. In the last 3 decades, as you all know, it's moved to the mobile phone. So this is one way, and we end in 2011 because, unfortunately, the 2021 census, as you all know, was not done. But here we are illustrating another aspect of state building, which is the physical presence of the state. State building is not just having a geography. The state has to be present. And it's present usually in countries. Among the first 3 signs are a public school, a post office, and a police outpost. The 3 sort of physical manifestations that the state is present in a particular area. And here we sort of take you through a few indicators to show how far a village was from these physical indicators that there is a state out there, right? And you see, again, I'm not showing you the data for the intermediate years, but most of these, other than the post office, really accelerate after 1991. Much of India's villages were far from roads, didn't have schools for long periods of time. All of this begins to change quite rapidly after 1991. Now I'll turn to Arvind.
Thank you, Devesh. I want to reinforce what Devesh said, to thank all of you for coming here, and also to our moderator and our discussant in absentia. Hopefully he will kind of come here very soon. Apparate in the Harry Potter sense, apparate here and come soon. So Devesh spoke about the overall approach of the book, and the framework of nation, state, markets, economy, all done under conditions of universal franchise, on a really tricky population, full of diversity, large, etc. So I'm going to take you through what are the themes of the book and where we kind of come out in the final assessment. So when, just as Devesh said, we're not going to give you one prescription, we're not going to give you, one theme or one constant line running through the thing, because, 75 years one diverse India, complex India, 28 states, multiple political parties, complex society. So we don't have any one theme, but we have a few themes which I think run through the book, and I just want to go through them. I think this is something that Udayan also mentioned, the theme of precociousness. Devesh has spoken about democracy before development, but then the economic counterpart was services before manufacturing, or really doing high-skill activities, manufacturing services over labor-intensive or low-skill activities. And this manifests itself both domestically and internationally. So the domestic manifestation of this is what we call growth without structural transformation. This is well known. India does too much agriculture, too little formal manufacturing, and too much services. So this, I think, is well known. But there's a chapter in the book where the puzzle is really deeper than this, because the puzzle is really, if you ask us, or anyone, why didn't India have structural transformation between 1950 and say 1990? The answer would be self-evident, all the usual explanations: planning, stymieing economic activity in various forms, licensing, etc., etc. But the puzzle is, why in the era of rapid growth, between 1980 and 2015 or 16, India was amongst the most rapidly growing countries in the world, in the top 10, and yet this did not lead to structural transformation in the sense of, why didn't we do more formal manufacturing? Or the real counterpart of that, why didn't we provide enough employment to reasonable organized sector, reasonably high-paying, productive wages to the vast swath of the Indian population? And in the chapter, we have some new arguments for why India didn't have structural formation within growth. And I think I'm going to tantalize you by not giving you the explanation, and maybe we'll discuss it in the question answer, because I think there's some new elements there which we'd be happy to talk about. The international counterpart of that is skewed globalization. And the skewness happens in kind of along multiple dimensions. The chart on the left shows what is the median income of the household, different immigrant households in the US as a proportion of the per capita GDP, the equivalent earning back home. This is based on some excellent work that Devesh has done even independently. And clearly, India is top of the list, but the multiples, the numbers are also striking. The average Indian American household earns 30 times more than the per capita GDP of India, and India is, massively an outlier. So India had skewed globalization, benefiting talented and skilled people via labor mobility. The contrast is, via conventional trade, we were not able to provide the same for India's unskilled labor force. So this is a chart which shows on the y-axis what is a country's share of the global export market share in labor-intensive exports. On the x-axis is what is the country's global labor force share. So a trade intuition roughly is that, if you have 10% of global labor, unskilled labor, roughly you should have 10 plus or minus whatever share of global low-skill exports. And you see the two outliers. China has 22% of the global labor force and about 40% of global export market share. India has similar labor force share, but only 2 to 3% global export market share, labor-intensive goods. So via trade, we failed to exploit globalization. Via immigration, we kind of overexploited in a sense and provided opportunities for high-skilled labor. So the precociousness manifests both domestically and internationally. There's the other sense in which we use precociousness, which is not the sense of before, something done before it is due, but also a sense of irregular or unnatural sequencing. And here you see it in the policy choices. We emphasized welfare over public goods, by public goods meaning infrastructure, health, education. So state capitalism before public infrastructure, physical capital before human capital, and even within human capital, as we all know, emphasizing higher education to the neglect still persists of basic education. And I want to give a shout out to Rukmini, who's been trying hard to rectify that. And even in health, population control, disease control, emphasized over sanitation, nutrition, etc. And we have a lot of data. And a point that Devesh likes to make, which is also that, we enact laws, proliferation of laws, without being able to implement them with any degree of efficiency or anything, competence. So this just shows those those kind of odd prioritization, more public investment than public infrastructure, the difference being the state capitalism that we embarked upon, and more on public investment than education, and also in education, the spending per student much higher on higher education than on basic education, although this does improve over time. The second theme which we focus on is what we call my Bapism. It's, I think the English word statism does injustice to this thing, which is not just about socialism or state control. It's a kind of ideology that is party agnostic, group agnostic, because it's widely shared that, the state is refuge, protector, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, all of that, get your own pantheon of gods and goddesses, but, it's what you turn to. The state may fail you consistently, but you will still turn to the state for providing what it is demonstrably incapable of providing. Now, one of the manifestations of my Bapism is what we call the lack of exit. You know that we've always said, or in one of the surveys, India went from socialism without entry to capitalism without exit. And you see the lack of exit not just in that, but in many manifestations. We have compiled for the first time, from 1970 onwards, data on central public sector undertakings, and this shows the return on capital, which actually, apart from a brief period, has been quite low. And this is a chart well below any benchmark rates that you would expect. That's the red line. It's low and it's been consistently low. This is for central public sector enterprises. And of course, for the state, it's much worse. But the point here is that not just that the states do badly, whatever the center does merely badly, the states do much worse, but despite this consistent record of poor performance, very little accountability, very little pressure to exit, and part of the reason we say it's because of this my Bapism, you just don't want to get the state out of these things, so it persists and persists, but thankfully, of course, now, this is now no longer the drag on the economy that it used to be. This shows what the opportunity cost. So, in our kind of reading of the thing, very seldom have we consistently asked the question, what was the opportunity cost of the public sector at the central and the state level? And, it's pretty high. For the center, we calculate, 50 to 100% more infrastructure spending could have taken place. Similarly, the states could have spent 75 to 150% more on health, for example. The same thing is true in joint family banking, a very evocative term used by former Governor Y.V. Reddy. And what we want to show here is that the red stuff is, has to do with, banking and state activity. And the blue is how much it was supposed to lend for, commercial lending to the private sector for investment and so on. The balance was always loaded in terms of statism, and you can see the contrast between India's lending to the private, how much the banks lent to the private sector, and how much it happened in China and Korea, just orders of magnitude greater. So basically, the banking system was, a kind of statist activity, joint family with, all kinds of problems, including lack of exit, which we talk about later. The second theme is what we would call the primacy of economic growth. In the contest or in the age-old debate between who is right, Jagdish or Amartya Sen, we say that both have very incomplete explanations, because growth is not just a necessary, sufficient, whatever condition. Growth has been the most important thing. In fact, it has been everything in India. After 1980 and 1990, kind of everything or a lot changed in India. Poverty came down, economic lives improved. The dynamic of education changed after economic growth in multiple ways. And the irony, of course, is the era of growth and the neoliberal state, neoliberal policy is what started a really social welfare state in the true sense of the term. And you got that in the period of growth. Devesh has documented in other work how growth facilitated social change with Chandrabhan and others. And above all, of course, growth, so the way we write in the book is that economic growth was, growth was not just grist, grease, glue, and getaway. Above all, it was the acceleration of growth since 1980 that fomented the revolution of rising expectations, which allowed India to trace the Napoleon arc from civilizational diffidence and woundedness to mutinous aspiration for its 1.4 billion people. But of course, growth was also divergent growth, and that had both positive and downsides as well. It facilitated migration from poorer to richer regions, but also it created these tensions on fiscal federalism that we will touch upon. I'll show you a chart later here as well. So here's there are also surprises on economic growth. So it's not just that growth was everything, there are surprises. I would say, the most important surprise for us is a kind of analytical category error we've made about understanding the first 30 years of imports. The first 30 years, the planning era, is commonly characterized as import substitution. And we vehemently reject that because import substitution means you shut off foreign competition in order to favor the domestic enterprise. But India, it shut off foreign competition, but at the same time, it stymied domestic private enterprise through all kinds of controls, especially industrial licensing, and that created not import substitution, but actually scarcity. So we would vehemently insist that the first 30 years was not import substitution, but one of scarcity. No foreign supply, inefficient public sector supply, inefficient small-scale supply, and thwarted efficient private supply. In fact, the best way of thinking about this is actually something that Mukul Keshavan says about that era, the pre-91 scarcity era. It was a world where the absence of things was experienced not just as scarcity, but as a superior form of austerity. So that was kind of pre-1980s India, which I think... The second surprise is that when we say, oh, India doesn't grow as fast as China, something wrong, oh, is it democracy, is it autocracy? The surprise for us is that actually 1/3 of India, not just the southern states, the western states, Haryana, 1/3 of India's population grew at Chinese rates of growth and for as long as China's rapid growth. So it's interesting because then you can turn the question around and say, not that why doesn't India grow as well as China, but why is it that only some parts of India, 1/3, grow as rapidly as China and not other parts? And that, I think, was a huge surprise to us when we talk about growth. The other surprise is what we call the Kamadhenu fiscal state. This case certainly came as news to both of us. If you look again, not in the planning era and the import substitution era, but in the era of rapid growth, 1990 to the current, India has amongst close to the highest fiscal state amongst all emerging market countries. If you combine the center and the state and add in the parastatals and thing, you're looking at consistent average deficits upwards of double digits, somewhere between 10 and 12%. And the little circle is there because it's not comparable with the others, but the red bar basically says, compared to all these countries, India has... And so the question is, why is this the case? And what were the implications, which we discuss in greater detail. But we again attribute it to this wonderful democracy, which is about accommodating every particular interest. And The contrast we draw is, whereas Pranab Bardhan and others have famously spoken about, three big vested interests, bureaucrats, politicians, and industry coming together, what this tells you is that India is actually a capacious accommodator of all kinds of vested interests. And we show in the chart how on the tax system, by the way, tax GDP ratio in India from 1990 to today, the period of rapid growth, is basically flat. So the tax system capaciously excludes all kinds of constituencies, and the expenditure system capaciously includes all kinds of constituencies, which is why we have this Kamadhenu fiscal state. In fact, I can't resist reading I.G. Patel, who has this wonder, the great I.G. Patel. He says, I suspect the need to preserve the Indian Federation, the workings of a parliamentary democracy where 100 and even 1,000 flowers have been allowed to bloom, all led to a kind of eclectic melange where every policy of special pleading found a place. So it's not India as particular interest necessarily, but it's a capacious accommodator of all kinds of vested interests. Surprise. Again, on the fiscal federalism side, Devesh showed you the chart about how transfers from the richer to the poorer states have been rising over time. What is, I think, problematic in India is not that, this happens, this should happen in every federal polity, but in terms of the fixed identity and the rising magnitudes, those seem to be the real problem, as you can see. So this is just a chart which shows what is the transfer, fiscal transfer, relative to your contribution to the tax base. So above the horizontal line, you get more than you contribute to the tax base. Below the line, you give more, relative to your tax base. And the point that Devesh and I want to emphasize here is that it is not a north-south divide, at least on fiscal federalism. On political federalism, electoral federalism, it is tended to become a north-south issue. But in terms of fiscal federalism, the biggest kind of contributors, as it were, are in fact the West, Gujarat and Maharashtra, and Haryana, the North. And the South, while it does contribute, its contribution has been rising over time, like all the others. In magnitude, you see the red line below the horizontal line is above the two small black lines, the two small black lines being the West and the North. And similarly, on the other side, it's again made out to be, from the recipient side between North and between the Hindi heartland and the others. In fact, you find that both the Hindi heartland and the East have benefited from transfers. In addition, of course, to what Devesh has spoken about, that the maximum transfers have, of course, accrued to the border states. Also for geopolitical and security reasons. So while fiscal transfers have been part of fiscal federalism, the nature, the identity, the magnitudes are what are creating problems, but it's not north-south that you should take this as a problem or the axis of disagreement. So let me end assessment. I think the magic and paradox of India, the sustaining democracy, what Devesh spoke about, maintaining order, building a state, creating a federal structure which called the Amicable Union by Granville Austin. That's the magic and paradox. The under-recognized achievement, what Devesh spoke about, how democracy itself became an instrument of maintaining order and state building. The delayed and partial success, I want to show you this. GDP per capita over 75 years. The line at the bottom is India. Essentially, in relative terms, relative to the rest of the world, from 1950 to 1980, India's relative position deteriorates. After 1980, it improves, but it's still in the bottom third percentile or fourth percentile. We're still far away from being a success, despite the rapid growth after 1980, and despite the fact that 1/3 of India grew as fast as China. The other thing we would say is that what is the durable disappointment of India? And there are many, many manifestations which we discuss in the book, but the one summary one is that how on a human development index that in fact we are in fact no better today in relative terms than we were in 1950. And of course, lots of people have spoken about health education, but as Devesh likes to emphasize, the manifestations are more broader. The sense of fraternity is also something that's eluded us, and so this is the durable disappointment of India. And of course, remember, the durable disappointment and the delayed and partial success are aggravated by the fact that we had this under-recognized achievement of order and nation building, which provided the foundation for what should have been much greater progress. So magic and paradox, the under-recognized achievement, the delayed and partial success, the durable disappointment. Of course, the abiding irony which we discuss in the book is that all these achievements of, as we say, what democracy gave, it also took away. And we discuss the various ways in which both democracy gave, which Devesh has spoken about, but also the various ways in which democracy took away. I think there's a line somewhere we say, if the price of democracy is the absence of revolution, the pricelessness of democracy is the averting of disorder. So you see the flip, and there are kind of various manifestations of that. And of course, the looming tragedy of India is all those early successes that we spoke about: order, nation building, federalism, democracy. Those are under threat, under serious threat. And so in some ways, there were failures initially which have been remedied, but the early successes are, threatening to fray, and I think this would be, so, normally assessments are good, bad. India is, both, what's the word, Joan Robinson, both India and the opposite is true. India lives in many ages. I think we have tried to avoid that by giving a more kind of nuanced assessment of the various ways in which India succeeded. And I have to end where Devesh began, democracy and development. So last year's Nobel Prize winners basically won the Nobel Prize for this chart. I'm exaggerating, but basically this is it. What they say is that on the y-axis you have economic development, on the x-axis you have democracy, and basically what they said is in the long run, on average, the greater the political institutions, more inclusive they are, more open they are, more contestable they are, the better for economic performance. And that's why the line is a very strong fit line. And in earlier work I had showed that, unfortunately this theory, fantastic Nobel Prize winning theory, couldn't explain China and India, but in opposite directions. China was too rich given its political institutions, and India was too poor given its supposedly political institutions. So that was something that, but then it struck us, if you do, and this is going to be my last slide, can we provide any evidence, meta-evidence for this precocious democracy that we keep harping on in the book, and that by the end, you might get bored and tired of this term? And this same chart now, I'm going to show you with all the other countries. And here's the interesting thing. While China is an outlier, it is not an unusual outlier, if I may say that, unusual. There are lots of countries who still overperform relative to their political institutions, the Koreas, the Singapores, etc., etc. But notice the blue circle that in the democracy part of the spectrum, India is fairly a unique outlier amongst democracies. Very few long-run consistent democracies have ended up not being as successful as some of the others. So it's in this sense that, India is maybe a precocious democracy. So where Devesh began with the sequencing of economic and political development, want to end by saying that, maybe this theme of precocious democracy might have some, even if it's kind of imperfect and meta-evidence to support it. So thank you all for listening. Sorry for carrying on. As we say on the book, I don't know whether we provide quality, but we provide lots of quantity as far as the book goes. So, thank you.